There is a question that quietly shapes every human life. Most people never ask it. Most people never even realize it exists. Yet it influences their thoughts, their decisions, their relationships, their character, and ultimately their future. The question is simple. What are you feeding? Because whether you realize it or not, something inside you is always growing. Always. Every day, every conversation, every thought, every habit, every piece of information you consume is feeding something. Fear or courage, faith or doubt, gratitude or resentment, wisdom or foolishness, hope or despair. Nothing remains untouched. Nothing remains neutral. We often imagine that growth is something intentional, something we choose, something we pursue. But growth happens even when we are not paying attention. A neglected garden still grows. The problem is that it rarely grows what was intended. Leave a garden unattended long enough, and it will not remain empty. Something will take root. Something will spread. Something will claim the space. The same is true of the human heart. The same is true of the human mind. The same is true of the human soul. If you do not choose what enters your life, something else will choose for you. And that is one of the great dangers of the modern world. Because never before in human history have people consumed so much while reflecting so little. Information, opinions, news, entertainment, conflict, comparison, distraction, hour after hour, day after day, year after year. And yet very few people stop to ask, what is all of this producing inside me? Because everything produces something. Everything leaves a mark. Every repeated thought strengthens a pathway. Every repeated emotion deepens a tendency. Every repeated action reinforces an identity. The things we feed eventually become stronger, not because life is unfair, but because growth is one of the most consistent laws in existence. Whatever receives nourishment expands. Whatever receives attention develops. Whatever receives energy becomes stronger. That principle works regardless of whether we understand it. A person who constantly feeds resentment should not be surprised when bitterness grows. A person who constantly feeds fear should not be surprised when anxiety grows. A person who constantly feeds comparison should not be surprised when contentment disappears. The outcome follows the nourishment. It always has. And perhaps that is uncomfortable to hear, because it places responsibility back into our hands. It forces us to look beyond circumstances, beyond other people, beyond excuses, and ask a far more difficult question. What am I allowing to grow inside me? Most people spend years trying to change their external lives. Very few spend time examining their internal diet. Yet the internal life is where everything begins. Every action begins there. Every habit begins there. Every decision begins there. Every future begins there. Long before a life changes outwardly, something changes inwardly. Long before character becomes visible, character is being formed. Long before a person arrives somewhere meaningful, a direction has already been chosen inside them. That direction is often determined by what they repeatedly consume, what they repeatedly focus on, what they repeatedly give their attention to. And attention is far more powerful than most people realize, because attention is not passive. Attention is nourishment. Whatever receives your attention receives your energy. Whatever receives your energy receives your growth. This is why two people can live in the same world and become entirely different human beings. They are feeding different things. One feeds gratitude, the other feeds resentment. One feeds wisdom, the other feeds distraction. One feeds faith, the other feeds fear. The environment may be similar. The outcome becomes radically different, because life often grows in the direction of our attention. And if there is one resource more valuable than money, more valuable than talent, and more valuable than opportunity, it may be attention itself. Because where attention goes, growth follows. Most people believe their greatest battles take place in the outside world. They believe the struggle is against circumstances, against difficult people, against bad luck, against limitations, against obstacles standing in their path. And certainly those things exist. Life is not free from hardship. Every person encounters resistance. Every person experiences disappointment. Every person carries burdens. But many of the battles that shape a life are not external at all. They are internal. They happen quietly, unseen by others, often unnoticed even by the person experiencing them. Because the greatest battle is often the battle for attention, the battle for what will occupy your mind, the battle for what will dominate your thoughts, the battle for what will be allowed to grow. Every day, forces compete for your attention. Fear competes for it. Anger competes for it. Envy competes for it. Distraction competes for it. Comfort competes for it. Meaning competes for it. Purpose competes for it. Wisdom competes for it. Faith competes for it. And the winner is rarely determined by strength alone. The winner is determined by nourishment. What you repeatedly feed gains influence. What you repeatedly neglect loses influence. This is why some people become trapped in cycles they cannot seem to escape. Not because they are weak, not because they are incapable, because they are unknowingly feeding the very thing they are trying to overcome. A person spends years feeding fear and wonders why courage feels distant. A person spends years feeding resentment and wonders why peace feels impossible. A person spends years feeding distraction and wonders why purpose feels unclear. The outcome should not surprise us. Growth follows nourishment, always. Imagine a fire burning in the darkness. Every thought you entertain is a piece of wood. Every conversation you revisit is a piece of wood. Every grievance you rehearse is a piece of wood. Every fear you obsess over is a piece of wood. Eventually, the fire becomes large enough to dominate the entire landscape, not because it appeared suddenly, because it was fed consistently. The same principle works in the opposite direction. Every act of gratitude feeds gratitude. Every act of courage feeds courage. Every act of discipline feeds discipline. Every act of faith feeds faith. Small actions, small choices, small moments, yet none of them remain small forever. That is one of the most important truths a person can learn. Nothing remains small forever. A small bitterness becomes a hardened heart. A small compromise becomes a pattern. A small distraction becomes a lifestyle. A small fear becomes a prison. But a small act of integrity can become character. A small act of faith can become confidence. A small act of discipline can become freedom. Everything grows. Everything multiplies. Everything expands according to what it is given. And this reality forces us to confront something many people spend years avoiding. We become responsible not only for our actions, but for what we repeatedly allow into our minds, because the mind was never designed to consume endlessly without consequence. Every environment shapes us. Every influence affects us. Every repeated exposure leaves fingerprints behind. The books we read, the voices we trust, the people we admire, the conversations we entertain, the content we consume, the thoughts we revisit. All of these things are feeding something. The question is whether they are feeding what you hope will grow. Because many people are trying to build a life that their daily habits are quietly undermining. They want peace, but they feed anxiety. They want confidence, but they feed comparison. They want purpose, but they feed distraction. They want wisdom, but they feed noise. And over time, the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore, because eventually, life reflects what has been nourished, not what has been wished for, not what has been talked about, not what has been promised, what has been nourished. That is why attention deserves far more respect than it receives. Attention is not merely observation. Attention is investment. Whatever you pay attention to is receiving part of your life, part of your energy, part of your focus, part of your future. And once that investment is repeated often enough, growth becomes inevitable. The mind follows what it repeatedly studies. The heart follows what it repeatedly loves. Character follows what it repeatedly practices, and the future follows what repeatedly shapes the character, which means the quality of your future may depend far less on what you achieve and far more on what you choose to feed. And perhaps this is why wisdom has always been less concerned with what a person does occasionally and more concerned with what a person does consistently. Because consistency reveals affection. Consistency reveals priorities. Consistency reveals devotion. Anyone can have a good day. Anyone can make a good decision. Anyone can experience a moment of inspiration. But what a person repeatedly returns to reveals what is truly shaping them. And shaping is the right word, because life is constantly shaping us. Every experience shapes us. Every relationship shapes us. Every disappointment shapes us. Every success shapes us. The question is not whether shaping is occurring. The question is whether we are participating in that process consciously. Most people understand the importance of protecting their physical health. They understand that what enters the body matters. Food matters. Exercise matters. Rest matters. Neglect those things long enough, and consequences appear. Nobody is surprised by this. Yet many people approach their minds and hearts as if different rules apply. They carefully monitor what enters their bodies while carelessly allowing anything to enter their thoughts. Anything. Fear, noise, outrage, comparison, endless distraction. Then they wonder why peace feels distant, why clarity feels rare, why purpose feels weak. The answer is often hidden in plain sight. You cannot continually feed confusion and expect clarity to grow. You cannot continually feed fear and expect courage to flourish. You cannot continually feed negativity and expect hope to remain strong. The human soul was never designed to operate independently from what it consumes. Everything leaves an imprint, even things that seem harmless, even things that seem insignificant, especially things that are repeated. Because repetition is one of the most powerful forces in human life. Repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity creates comfort. Comfort creates acceptance. Acceptance creates identity. And identity eventually directs behavior. This process happens quietly. Most people never notice it. Nobody wakes up one morning completely transformed. Transformation happens gradually, thought by thought, choice by choice, day by day, until eventually the person becomes the sum of what they have repeatedly embraced. That truth should not create fear, it should create awareness. Because awareness creates freedom. The moment you become aware of what is feeding your life, you gain the ability to choose differently. You gain the ability to redirect attention. You gain the ability to interrupt patterns. You gain the ability to nourish something better. And that may be one of the greatest gifts a person can receive. The realization that growth is not entirely accidental. That who you become is not merely the result of circumstances. That your inner world is not helpless. You have influence there. You have stewardship there. You have responsibility there. Not complete control, but meaningful influence. Enough influence to change direction. Enough influence to choose what deserves nourishment. Enough influence to decide what should no longer be fed. Because not everything deserves your attention. Not every thought deserves your agreement. Not every fear deserves your energy. Not every criticism deserves your focus. Not every distraction deserves your time. Some things become powerful only because we continue feeding them. Some fears survive because we continually revisit them. Some insecurities survive because we continually rehearse them. Some wounds remain dominant because we continually live inside them. And while pain should never be ignored, neither should it become the primary source of nourishment for your identity. Because what you continually revisit begins to define you, not immediately, but gradually. And gradual influence is often the most powerful influence of all. A river does not shape a canyon in a day, yet over time it changes the entire landscape. In the same way, repeated thoughts reshape the inner landscape of a person. Repeated beliefs reshape expectations. Repeated attention reshapes priorities. Repeated focus reshapes identity, and identity reshapes life. That is why the battle for attention is ultimately a battle for becoming. Because what you repeatedly focus on is quietly teaching you who you are. And who you are becoming will determine far more about your future than most people ever realize. Most people spend their lives trying to change their circumstances. They rarely stop to consider that circumstances often follow identity, and identity follows nourishment. This is why two people can experience the same hardship and emerge completely differently. One becomes stronger, one becomes bitter, one develops wisdom, one develops resentment, one discovers purpose, one loses hope. The hardship may be similar, the outcome is not. Because circumstances are not the only force at work, there is also the question of what each person chooses to feed while moving through the hardship. One feeds gratitude, the other feeds grievance. One feeds meaning, the other feeds despair. One feeds courage, the other feeds fear. And eventually those inner choices become visible realities. This was something Viktor Frankl observed in the darkest conditions imaginable. Two people could stand in the same suffering and yet become entirely different human beings. Not because suffering was different, because the response was different, because what was nourished was different. And that truth remains just as relevant today. Most people are not living in concentration camps, but they are living in environments that constantly compete for their attention. And attention is one of the most valuable resources they possess. Perhaps the most valuable, because unlike money, attention shapes the person spending it. Whatever captures your attention is influencing your development, whether you realize it or not, whether you intend it or not. This is why modern life creates a unique challenge. Never before have so many people had access to so much information, yet never before have so many people struggled to maintain focus. The average person consumes thousands of messages every day. Opinions, headlines, videos, notifications, arguments, predictions, advertisements, and every one of them wants something: your attention, your focus, your emotional energy. Because attention is valuable. The world understands this. Companies understand this. Algorithms understand this. Advertisers understand this. The question is whether you understand it. Because if you do not intentionally direct your attention, someone else will. And when someone else controls your attention long enough, they begin influencing your growth. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. Which is why one of the most important questions a person can ask is not, "What am I doing with my life?" but "What is shaping my life?" Those are not the same question. Many people focus entirely on actions. Wisdom often begins by examining influences, because influences eventually become actions. Actions become habits. Habits become character. Character becomes destiny. Everything begins somewhere upstream. And upstream is where attention lives. Upstream is where thoughts live. Upstream is where beliefs live. Upstream is where nourishment occurs. Most people try to solve problems downstream. They try to change behavior without changing what feeds behavior. They try to change outcomes without changing influences. They try to change their future without changing what occupies their minds. That approach rarely works for long, because sooner or later, what is fed reasserts itself. The root always reveals itself through the fruit, not immediately, but eventually, always. A person can pretend to be peaceful for a while, but if fear is being fed every day, fear eventually appears. A person can pretend to be confident for a while, but if insecurity is being nourished constantly, insecurity eventually surfaces. A person can pretend to be hopeful for a while, but if despair receives daily attention, despair eventually grows stronger. Nothing remains hidden forever. Growth reveals itself. And perhaps that is why self-awareness is so valuable. Self-awareness allows us to recognize what is happening beneath the surface. It allows us to see patterns before they become prisons. It allows us to identify influences before they become identities. It allows us to ask difficult but necessary questions. Why do I think this way? Why do I react this way? Why do I keep returning to the same fears? Why do I keep repeating the same patterns? What am I feeding? Because beneath many struggles lies a source of nourishment that has gone unnoticed. And until that source is confronted, growth remains difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. Because you cannot starve fear while feeding it daily. You cannot weaken resentment while rehearsing it every night. You cannot strengthen faith while giving all your attention to doubt. You cannot strengthen purpose while constantly feeding distraction. Growth follows nourishment. The principle is simple. The consequences are profound. And the person who understands this gains something incredibly valuable: the ability to stop living reactively and begin living intentionally. Living intentionally sounds simple, yet it is one of the most difficult things a person can do, because intentional living requires resistance. Resistance against distraction, resistance against impulse, resistance against whatever happens to demand attention in the moment. And modern life is designed to make that resistance difficult. Everything is competing to become the center of your focus. Everything is competing to shape your emotions. Everything is competing to influence what grows inside you. Which means intentional living begins with intentional attention. You must decide what deserves space in your mind. You must decide what deserves influence in your life. You must decide what deserves nourishment. Because if you do not make those decisions, they will be made for you. And that is a dangerous way to live. Not because other people are evil, not because the world is hopeless, but because anything left unattended eventually becomes vulnerable to outside influence. A ship without a captain drifts. A garden without a gardener changes. A mind without direction becomes occupied. The question is never whether something will occupy the space. The question is, what will occupy it? This is why wisdom has always emphasized vigilance, not paranoia, not fear. Vigilance, the awareness that what enters your life matters, the awareness that influences matter, the awareness that attention matters. Because every influence carries seeds. Every conversation carries seeds. Every book carries seeds. Every relationship carries seeds. Every idea carries seeds. And seeds rarely announce what they will become. A seed appears small, harmless, insignificant. Yet within it exists the potential for an entire future. The same is true of thoughts. A thought appears small, yet repeated often enough it becomes a belief. A belief appears small, yet repeated often enough it becomes a perspective. A perspective appears small, yet repeated often enough it becomes a way of life. This is why the inner life deserves so much care, because everything external eventually grows from something internal. Long before a person speaks, they think. Long before a person acts, they believe. Long before a person becomes something, they are being shaped by something, and shaping often happens quietly, almost invisibly. No one notices the first day comparison enters their life. No one notices the first day bitterness begins to grow. No one notices the first day distraction starts weakening focus. The changes seem insignificant, yet significance is often hidden inside repetition. A single drop of water changes little. Thousands of drops reshape stone. A single fearful thought changes little. Years of fearful thinking reshape a life. A single act of gratitude changes little. Years of gratitude reshape a life. Everything accumulates. Everything compounds. Everything grows. And this should encourage you, because it means transformation does not require dramatic moments. Transformation requires consistent nourishment. You do not become courageous by waiting for courage. You become courageous by feeding courage. You do not become disciplined by wishing for discipline. You become disciplined by practicing discipline. You do not become hopeful by demanding certainty. You become hopeful by nourishing hope. The growth may feel slow. The progress may feel invisible. But invisible growth is still growth. In fact, some of the most important growth happens beneath the surface. Before anyone sees it. Before anyone applauds it. Before anyone recognizes it. Character grows that way. Wisdom grows that way. Faith grows that way. Strength grows that way. Quietly. Gradually. Faithfully. And because the growth is gradual, many people underestimate it. They underestimate the power of a daily habit, the power of a daily thought, the power of a daily decision, the power of a daily influence. Yet those small things eventually become large things. The life of a person is often determined less by dramatic events and more by repeated influences. Repeated truths, repeated lies, repeated fears, repeated hopes, repeated choices, repeated nourishment. This is why the question remains so important. What are you feeding? Because the answer to that question may explain far more about your future than any prediction ever could. The answer may explain your direction, your habits, your peace, your confidence, your relationships, your purpose, your character. Because every one of those things is growing in response to something. And whatever you continue to nourish today will become stronger tomorrow. And perhaps the most dangerous assumption a person can make is believing that growth only happens when they are trying to grow. Because growth never waits for permission. Growth is happening all the time. The question is simply what direction it is moving. A person can grow in wisdom, or grow in foolishness, grow in patience, or grow in frustration, grow in gratitude, or grow in entitlement, grow in faith, or grow in fear. Both paths involve growth. Both paths involve development. Both paths involve becoming. The difference lies in what is being nourished. This is why neglect is never neutral. Many people imagine that if they stop paying attention to their inner life, everything will simply remain the same. But nothing remains the same. What is neglected does not stand still. It weakens. A neglected friendship weakens. A neglected skill weakens. A neglected body weakens. A neglected character weakens. The same principle applies to every meaningful part of life. Strength requires nourishment. And whatever is not nourished eventually loses influence. This is important because many people spend their lives trying to remove negative things without replacing them with something better. They try to stop worrying, but they never feed trust. They try to stop being distracted, but they never feed purpose. They try to stop being bitter, but they never feed gratitude. They try to stop being fearful, but they never feed courage. Nature rarely tolerates emptiness. Remove something without replacing it and the space rarely stays vacant for long. This is why transformation is not merely subtraction, it is replacement. It is not enough to remove what is unhealthy. Something healthy must take its place. It is not enough to starve fear. Courage must be fed. It is not enough to weaken resentment. Forgiveness must be fed. It is not enough to reject distraction. Purpose must be fed. It is not enough to resist despair. Hope must be fed, because the human soul was never designed to thrive on absence alone. It thrives on nourishment. It thrives on truth. It thrives on meaning. It thrives on purpose. It thrives on what strengthens it. And perhaps that is why so many people feel exhausted. Not because they are carrying too much responsibility, but because they are feeding themselves too little of what actually gives strength. They consume information but receive little wisdom. They consume entertainment but receive little meaning. They consume opinions but receive little truth. They consume noise but receive little peace. Their minds remain full, yet their inner lives remain undernourished. And there is a profound difference between being full and being nourished. One concerns quantity. The other concerns quality. A person can consume endlessly and still remain empty. A person can absorb information endlessly and still remain directionless. Because nourishment is not determined by volume. It is determined by value. And wisdom has always been the ability to recognize the difference. To recognize that not everything deserves equal access to your attention. Not everything deserves equal influence over your thoughts. Not everything deserves equal space within your life. Some things strengthen you. Some things weaken you. Some things bring clarity. Some things create confusion. Some things deepen purpose. Some things scatter it. And every day you are making decisions about which influences will receive nourishment, whether consciously or unconsciously, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Those decisions matter, more than most people realize, because every influence is moving you somewhere. Every influence is shaping something. Every influence is feeding something. The books you return to, the conversations you repeat, the voices you trust, the content you consume, the beliefs you rehearse, the stories you tell yourself. None of these things are passive. They are forming you. They are strengthening something. And what they strengthen will eventually become visible, because what grows beneath the surface never remains beneath the surface forever. Eventually it appears in decisions. Eventually it appears in relationships. Eventually it appears in habits. Eventually it appears in character. Eventually it appears in the life you are living, which means the quality of your life tomorrow is connected to the quality of what you are feeding today. Not perfectly, not immediately, but undeniably, because growth follows nourishment. And what you repeatedly nourish is quietly becoming who you are. And this is where many people misunderstand the nature of change. They believe change begins with action, but more often, change begins with affection. It begins with what captures the heart, because the heart always moves toward what it values. Attention follows value. Energy follows attention. Growth follows energy. And eventually an entire life follows growth. This is why some people repeatedly return to the same destructive patterns, not because they consciously desire destruction, but because something within them still finds nourishment there. A person may hate their anxiety and still feed it. A person may hate their resentment and still feed it. A person may hate their insecurity and still feed it. Because familiarity can be mistaken for comfort. Even when familiarity is hurting us, the known often feels safer than the unknown, even when the unknown contains freedom. And that is one of the great challenges of human life. Learning to nourish what is healthy before it becomes comfortable. Learning to nourish wisdom before wisdom feels natural. Learning to nourish discipline before discipline feels rewarding. Learning to nourish faith before faith feels easy. Because growth requires trust. Trust that what is being fed today will eventually bear fruit tomorrow. Not immediate fruit, not instant transformation, but gradual change. The kind of change that reshapes a life from the inside out. And perhaps this is why so many people quit too early. They expect visible results from invisible work. They expect immediate rewards from gradual processes. They expect transformation to happen in weeks when transformation often requires seasons. Yet nearly everything valuable in life develops slowly. Trust develops slowly. Character develops slowly. Wisdom develops slowly. Strength develops slowly. Even relationships deepen slowly. The things that matter most are rarely rushed. They are cultivated. And cultivation requires patience. A farmer does not plant a seed and demand a harvest the next morning. He understands something many people forget. Growth follows a timetable that cannot be forced. It can be supported. It can be nourished. It can be protected, but it cannot be rushed. The same is true of the inner life. You cannot force wisdom. You cannot force maturity. You cannot force depth. You can only create the conditions in which they grow. You can feed them. You can protect them. You can give them room to develop, and over time they become stronger. This perspective changes how a person views daily life. Suddenly, small choices matter more. Not because they create immediate results, because they create long-term direction. Every day becomes an opportunity to nourish something worthwhile. Every day becomes an opportunity to strengthen what matters. Every day becomes an opportunity to invest in the person you are becoming. And becoming is ultimately the story beneath every human life. Whether people realize it or not, they are always becoming something. More patient or more impatient. More grateful or more entitled. More courageous or more fearful. More disciplined or more distracted. More faithful or more cynical. Nobody remains unchanged. Life keeps moving. Character keeps developing. The only question is in which direction. And direction is determined less by dramatic moments than by repeated nourishment, repeated influences, repeated choices, repeated attention, repeated priorities. The things you consistently return to are shaping you. They are teaching you what matters. They are teaching you how to think. They are teaching you how to see the world. And eventually they are teaching you who you are. This is why the stories we tell ourselves matter so much. Because every person carries an internal narrative, a story about their past, a story about their future, a story about their limitations, a story about their possibilities. And whatever story is repeatedly rehearsed becomes stronger. If a person continually tells themselves they are incapable, that belief grows. If a person continually tells themselves they are trapped, that belief grows. If a person continually tells themselves that nothing will ever change, that belief grows. The story becomes nourishment, and nourishment becomes reality. Not because thoughts magically create the world, but because beliefs influence actions. Actions influence habits. Habits influence character. And character influences the course of a life. Which means some of the most important influences in your life are not external at all. They are internal. The conversations you have with yourself, the assumptions you repeat, the beliefs you reinforce, the conclusions you accept. All of these things are feeding something. All of these things are strengthening something. And whatever becomes strongest eventually begins leading the rest of your life. And perhaps nowhere is this more evident than in the way people interpret their own lives. Two people can look at the same circumstance and see entirely different realities. One sees an obstacle. The other sees an opportunity. One sees evidence of failure. The other sees a lesson. One sees a reason to quit. The other sees a reason to grow. The circumstance remains unchanged. The interpretation changes everything. And interpretation is not random. Interpretation grows from what has been fed over time. A hopeful mind tends to recognize possibility. A fearful mind tends to recognize danger. A grateful heart tends to recognize blessings. A resentful heart tends to recognize offenses. People often assume they are simply seeing reality, but many times they are seeing reality through the lens they have been feeding for years. This is why perspective matters so much. Perspective is not merely how you see the world. Perspective is how the world begins to shape you. Because every perspective creates patterns. Every pattern creates expectations. And expectations influence behavior. A person who expects failure behaves differently. A person who expects growth behaves differently. A person who expects rejection behaves differently. A person who expects possibility behaves differently. The expectation itself becomes nourishment, and nourishment becomes influence. This is one reason fear can become so powerful. Fear does not merely affect emotions. Fear affects perception. It changes what a person notices. It changes what a person anticipates. It changes what a person believes is possible. Eventually, fear becomes more than a feeling. It becomes a lens. And once fear becomes a lens, it begins shaping the entire experience of life. The same is true of hope. Hope is not merely optimism. Hope is not pretending difficulties do not exist. Hope is the conviction that difficulty does not have the final word. Hope allows a person to continue investing when results are invisible. Hope allows a person to continue believing when certainty is unavailable. Hope allows a person to continue growing when progress feels slow. And like every other powerful force, hope must be fed. It does not survive automatically. It grows when nourished. It grows when protected. It grows when given attention. This is why wise people are careful about what they repeatedly expose themselves to. Not because they are fragile, because they understand influence. They understand that attention is valuable. They understand that repeated exposure becomes repeated nourishment, and repeated nourishment becomes character. Character is not built in a single moment. Character is built through accumulation. Thousands of small influences. Thousands of small decisions. Thousands of small acts of agreement. Little by little. Day by day. Until eventually, what was once a choice becomes a tendency. What was once a tendency becomes a habit. What was once a habit becomes a character trait. And what was once a character trait becomes a way of life. This process happens so gradually that most people never notice it. They only notice the outcome. They notice the bitterness. They notice the confidence. They notice the wisdom. They notice the fear. They notice the peace. But the outcome began long before it became visible. It began when something first started receiving nourishment. That is why every meaningful transformation begins with awareness. Awareness of what is entering your life. Awareness of what is shaping your thoughts. awareness of what is influencing your heart, awareness of what is receiving your attention, because awareness allows choice, and choice creates direction. Without awareness, people drift. With awareness, people begin steering. They begin deciding what deserves nourishment, what deserves attention, what deserves influence, and perhaps that is one of the most powerful forms of freedom available to a human being. The freedom to choose what will shape them, the freedom to decide what will grow, the freedom to stop feeding what weakens them and begin feeding what strengthens them. Not instantly, not perfectly, but intentionally. Because intentional growth has always been more powerful than accidental growth. Accidental growth leaves direction to chance. Intentional growth aligns direction with purpose, and purpose changes everything. Purpose gives attention a destination. Purpose gives discipline a reason. Purpose gives sacrifice meaning. Purpose gives growth direction. Without purpose, people consume endlessly. With purpose, people become selective. They become careful. They become intentional. They begin asking a different question, not, "What do I feel like feeding?" but, "What deserves to grow?" What deserves to grow? That question has the power to change an entire life, because it shifts attention away from impulse and toward intention, away from reaction and toward responsibility, away from whatever is loudest in the moment and toward what matters most in the long run. Most people do not lose direction because they make one catastrophic decision. They lose direction because they slowly begin feeding things that were never worthy of becoming dominant. Little distractions, little compromises, little resentments, little fears, little excuses. Each one seems insignificant. Each one appears harmless. Yet given enough nourishment, even small things become powerful things. A tiny crack can eventually split stone. A tiny spark can eventually consume a forest. A tiny seed can eventually become a towering tree. Growth magnifies whatever it touches, which means wisdom is not merely knowing what to pursue. Wisdom is knowing what should never be fed. There are thoughts that should not be nourished, fears that should not be entertained, voices that should not be trusted, narratives that should not be repeated, not because they are unpleasant, because they are destructive. Some ideas promise protection while quietly producing limitation. Some beliefs promise comfort while quietly producing weakness. Some habits promise relief while quietly producing dependency. The danger is that destruction rarely announces itself at the beginning. It usually arrives disguised as something harmless, something temporary, something manageable, until one day it has become far stronger than anyone intended. This is why self-examination is so valuable. Not self-condemnation, not endless self-criticism. Self-examination. The willingness to pause and ask, what is growing inside me? What has become stronger this year? What occupies my attention most often? What thoughts do I return to repeatedly? What emotions dominate my inner life? What am I feeding? Because honest answers create opportunities for change. And change begins long before circumstances improve. Change begins when awareness meets responsibility. The moment a person recognizes what is being fed, they gain the opportunity to choose differently, to redirect attention, to establish healthier influences, to strengthen better habits, to cultivate deeper truths, and perhaps most importantly, to stop giving energy to things that do not deserve control over their lives, because attention is a gift, a limited gift. Every day you receive only so much of it, only so much focus, only so much energy, only so much time. And wherever that attention goes, part of your life goes with it. This is why wise people guard their attention carefully, not because they fear the world, but because they understand the value of what they possess. They understand that attention eventually becomes direction. Direction eventually becomes character. Character eventually becomes destiny. And destiny is too important to leave in the hands of whatever happens to demand attention first. The person who understands this begins living differently. They become more selective, more intentional, more thoughtful, not perfect, not immune to distraction, not free from struggle, but aware. Aware that every day they are planting something, aware that every day they are feeding something, aware that every day they are strengthening something, and aware that whatever receives that nourishment will continue to grow. That awareness changes everything, because once you understand the principle, you begin seeing it everywhere. You begin seeing why certain fears became powerful, why certain habits became dominant, why certain beliefs shaped entire seasons of life. You begin understanding that growth was occurring all along. The only question was what direction it was moving. And perhaps that realization is one of the most liberating truths a person can discover. You may not control everything that happens to you. You may not control every circumstance. You may not control every difficulty. But you can become more intentional about what you feed. You can become more intentional about what receives your attention. You can become more intentional about what influences your mind, your heart, your character, and your future. Because what you feed grows. What you nourish strengthens. What you repeatedly give your attention to gradually becomes part of you. And one day, often sooner than you expect, what has been growing beneath the surface will become visible for everyone to see. So choose carefully. Choose intentionally. Choose wisely. Because the person you become tomorrow is being shaped by what you are feeding today. There is a final truth worth remembering. The things that shape a life are rarely dramatic in the beginning. They begin quietly, almost invisibly. A thought, a habit, a belief, a daily influence, a repeated choice, something so small that it appears incapable of changing anything. Yet life has always been shaped by small things, repeated consistently. A single drop of water seems powerless, yet enough drops carve canyons. A single step seems insignificant, yet enough steps cross continents. A single decision feels small, yet enough decisions create a destiny. The same is true of the inner life. No one becomes wise overnight. No one becomes courageous overnight. No one becomes disciplined overnight. No one becomes faithful overnight. These qualities grow. They are cultivated. They are nourished. They are strengthened through repeated attention. And because the process is gradual, many people underestimate it. They underestimate what a year of gratitude can do. They underestimate what a year of discipline can do. They underestimate what a year of purpose can do. They underestimate what a year of feeding the right things can do. But growth never underestimates itself. Growth simply continues. Day after day. Choice after choice. Quietly transforming what it touches. That is why the future often surprises people. Not because it arrived suddenly, because they failed to notice what had been growing all along. The strong character, the deeper wisdom, the calmer spirit, the clearer purpose, the stronger faith. None of these appeared in a moment. They were fed, and what was fed became strong. The same principle works in reverse. The fears that dominate people, the bitterness that consumes people, the distractions that weaken people, the habits that control people, they did not appear overnight either. They were fed. And what was fed became strong. This is why responsibility is not a burden. It is a gift. Because responsibility reminds us that we are not powerless. We have influence over what grows. We have influence over what receives our attention. We have influence over what we nourish. Not complete control, but meaningful influence. Enough influence to change direction. Enough influence to strengthen what matters. Enough influence to become intentional instead of reactive. And perhaps that is the invitation hidden within this entire message. To become more aware, more deliberate, more intentional about what receives access to your mind, your heart, your attention, your life. Because every day you are feeding something. Every day you are strengthening something. Every day you are becoming something. The question has never been whether growth is happening. The question is, what is growing? So examine your attention, examine your influences, examine your habits, examine the stories you repeatedly tell yourself, Examine the voices you continually trust, and ask yourself honestly, what am I feeding? Because whatever you repeatedly nourish today will become stronger tomorrow. Whatever becomes stronger tomorrow will influence who you become, and who you become will shape the life you ultimately live. Choose wisely. Choose intentionally. Choose what deserves to grow. Because your future is not only shaped by your actions, it is shaped by what you continually nourish within yourself. If this message spoke to you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Not because of numbers, but because we are building a community committed to wisdom, purpose, faith, responsibility, and genuine growth. And if you know someone who needs this message, share this video with them. You never know how one idea, one conversation, or one moment of clarity can change the direction of a life. Thank you for spending this time with me. And remember, what you feed grows. Feed wisely.